We're continuing tonight with the second part of our series on the religion of Islam. And to the Muslim mind, Muhammad is the most important person in all of history. Islam is centered upon his life, and he is pivotal in understanding the origin and the development of this world religion. And as we look at the biography of his life, one thing that's quite important is that there is no non-Muslim biography of him that's still in existence. In other words, all the ones that we do have are by different Muslims of different times. Obviously, we could talk about his life for many hours in detail, and those writings are available. So tonight is just kind of a short summary of some of the major events in his life, especially those events that had consequences as far as the religion of Islam is concerned. And those are the ones, of course, we want to focus on. It won't be a very long lesson, but it will be a lesson that's important for us to understand Islam. And we hear the name Muhammad a lot. When I was growing up, I probably didn't hear it half a dozen times, but now you hear it quite often because, as was mentioned last Sunday, Islam is one of the fastest growing religions in the world. Not just in Middle Eastern countries, but in a lot of different countries all over the world. So knowing about his life will help us a great deal in understanding this religion, as well as relating to others about him. The first date of significance is when he was born, and that was in AD 570. So when we think about it, that's over 1,500 years ago, or almost 1,500 years. He was born in the town of Mecca. Another place that is very prominent, of course, in the religion of Islam. It is in the western part of Saudi Arabia. And he certainly had a difficult time as a young person. His father died before he was even born, so he did not know his father at all. His mother died, and her name was Amina. I believe that's how it's pronounced. She died when he was only 6. So it's very significant that at an early age he had lost both of his parents. So by the time he was 6, both of his mom and dad were both passed away. So as a result, he was raised by his grandfather and then by his uncle. And especially his uncle had a great influence on him throughout his life. So he was raised by his grandfather and then by his uncle. As in many ethnic groups, there were tribes, and still are, divisions of that particular ethnic group. Well, his family's tribe was the one that was the guardian of the Kaabah or Kaabah. I'm not exactly sure how it's pronounced in Arabic. It means cube. And so his family had the responsibility of guarding this. And this was a cube-shaped shrine. And this shrine was built so that each of the 4 corners pointed in one of the 4 main directions. In other words, one corner was due east, one corner was due west, and so forth. That's how it was built, this cube. And this shrine was located in Mecca. And the Muslims believe that it was built by Abraham and Ishmael. So it had great significance, this shrine did. So to them it was a very important shrine. Muslims believe that an angel brought a black stone that had fallen from heaven, and this stone had fallen from heaven in the time of Adam. And this stone was brought to Abraham, and he was told to take this stone and make a pilgrimage to Mecca. And so they believe that Abraham placed this stone in the building's eastern corner. Remember again, each of the four corners faced a direction. So this was placed in the eastern corner of this shrine, this building called the Kaabah or Kaabah. And this shrine, we'll hear about later, figured prominently in Muhammad's life. So it was an important structure to him as far as things that develop later on. As a young boy, he traveled in caravans with his uncle, and of course back during this time, that's how goods were moved, by caravans, whether it was camels or what. It was moved across the desert. And so he traveled in caravans with his uncle all over that part of the world, especially Syria. And no doubt he came in contact with Jews as well as Christians, because those two religious groups were prominent all over that part of the world. And so that was his upbringing. Lost his parents early, raised by a grandfather and then an uncle. He was of the tribe that guarded this shrine, and he learned about trade, he learned about caravans, and learned about other religions, especially the Jewish religion and Christian religion, at an early age. And then, the next important thing that happened in his life was in AD 595. This is when he gets married, or his first marriage anyway. He marries a wealthy widow there who was 15 years older than him. He was approximately 25, so she was about 40 at the time. And she, I don't know how to pronounce her last name, or her first name, it might be Khadijah, something similar to that. She becomes very devoted to him, very devoted to the religion that he will start. So she was a very important part of his life. She bore him 6 children, only one of which was able to bear him grandchildren and carry on the legacy, so to speak. But she was a very important part of Muhammad's life. And then, at age 40, as was mentioned last week, this is when he starts to receive the revelations. In AD 610. So he's 40 years old, and this is when his writings, this is when his biography says he received the first set of revelations. And these revelations allegedly came from the angel Gabriel. In other words, the Gabriel was the intermediary that delivered these messages to him. And this takes place on top of one of the mounts in that area. It's Hira. I don't know if it's Hira or Hira. This was a place that was very familiar to him. What he would do and had done prior to this time, this was a place he would go to be by himself, to pray and to meditate, to focus on things. And he would usually go there for 1 month at a time and 1 month out of the year. And the month that he would go there to meditate and to be by himself was the month Ramadan in the Arabic culture. And of course we mentioned last week how that was like the holy month for Muslims. He was, according to his revelations, he was appointed by Allah to reveal the word of Allah. In other words, he was now to become the spokesperson, the spokesman, the mouthpiece for Allah, and to reveal Allah's wishes to the world. And even though he was illiterate, as we mentioned last week, he recited what he had heard through these revelations while others wrote them down. So it was a number of years before all of these, of course, were written down, because it was a 20-year period that he receives these revelations. Well, he would have these revelations, and then he would recite them. And basically that's what the word Quran means, recite or recitations. And so it is a book filled with Muhammad's recitations, his recitals to people of what he had heard from the angel Gabriel. and others would write these down because he was not able to. So this is when it all began as far as the beginning of the Quran. Then, in the years 612 through 616, several significant things happened. After a couple years, he begins teaching these revelations that he had received. So he has received these from Gabriel, and now he starts telling others what he had heard. But at first he got very, very few converts. Very few people listened to him. Jews and Christians both believed that his revelations were fake. In other words, neither group believed that he had actually spoken to Gabriel, that these had came from any sort of divine source. So neither one of those groups, Jews or Christians, believed in these divine revelations. During the first 3 years that he began teaching, from like 612 to 615, only about 40 people accepted Islam. So it had very, very humble beginnings as far as people. Very few were willing to listen to him. Again, most people didn't believe these were divine or they were real, just something apparently he had just made up. But one of his converts was his wife, that I mentioned a while ago. Also during this time, Muslims began to be persecuted quite severely for their religion by other groups. Of course, there were lots of pagan religions in that part of the world that didn't like what Muhammad was preaching, because Muhammad, of course, was preaching, as we'll start seeing next Sunday and after, that there was one God. Well, pagan religions tended to believe in more than one God. They were polytheistic. But what he was preaching was monotheism, and they didn't like it. So some of the persecution would come from them. There was a ban by other groups that was put on Muslims. You couldn't marry Muslims, nor were you supposed to trade with Muslims. And that lasted from about 616 to 618. They weren't allowed, people weren't allowed to have contact or associations with them. And then that ban was lifted, and shortly after that, his wife and then his uncle, who were two of his biggest supporters, both passed away just shortly after that ban was lifted. So two of his main supporters died within a short period of time. And you know that certainly affected him. He is in his 40s, as we mentioned. Now, one of the most significant events in his life is about ready to take place. This is in AD 621, a very, very important year in his life. Two important things happen. These are some of the recitations, again, that he alleged that happened. He said that the angel Gabriel took him to Jerusalem. Of course, he's been in Mecca. Took him from Mecca to Jerusalem and back in one night. Now, normally that would take, I think I remember, weeks or months. I don't remember. A long trip from Mecca to Jerusalem by camel. But he alleged that Gabriel took him to Jerusalem, all the way from Mecca to Jerusalem and back in one night. And he rode on a white horse, a winged horse, and it was called B-U-R-A-Q. I don't know exactly how that's pronounced. I could guess, but I'd probably be wrong. But this winged horse is how he got from Mecca to Jerusalem and back. And it obviously was able to, according to him, fly him very quickly. Well, what happened, he said, in Jerusalem was very significant, because he said this horse took him to what is today called the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem. And of course, to Muslims, that's one of the most holy places in the world, is the Dome of the Rock. I think it's considered first or second of their holiest sites. I think the second. And of course, today that is a hugely contested area in Jerusalem, and I'm sure it always will be. But he said while he was at the Dome of the Rock, he met and talked to Abraham, he met and talked to Moses, He met and talked with Jesus, and he met and talked with others as well. But he said he met them while he was there and talked with them. Also on this night, he said that he was taken to heaven. And while he was in heaven, he was able to see the signs of God. And one of the most significant teachings of Islam, he said, happened during this time. Because he said while he was in heaven, he received the command that Muslims had to pray 50 times per day. 50. Well, as he was leaving heaven, Moses met him. And basically Moses asked him, what happened. And he said, well, I was told by Allah that Muslims had to pray 50 times a day. Well, Moses said, that's too many times. You go back and see if you can change it to 40, or change it. And so he did, and he comes back and it was changed to 40, and Moses said, oh, that's still too much, and go back. And so this went on and on, this conversation and him going back into heaven. And finally, Allah said, okay, 5 times a day. And of course, that's what Muslims today do. They pray 5 times a day. So that's, again, one of those foundational beliefs of Islam. That's where it came from, was this alleged conversation between him and Moses, and then him and Allah. So that was all in one night back in the year 621. Again, a very, very significant year and event in the religion of Islam. Then in the years 622 to 624, another one of the most significant events in the history of Islam takes place. He and about 70 families flee to Medina, which is about 250 miles north. And this was, the reason for this was that there was a plot to kill him, and he was, again, allegedly warned by Gabriel to leave in some sort of vision or something. He was told to leave, so he left and went to Medina. This is called the night of migration in Islam, the night of migration. And this is considered the beginning of the Muslim era. That night, when he and those families left to go to Medina, is considered the beginning of the Muslim area, this night of migration. During this time, he tells followers to start praying toward Mecca. So here's another one of the beginnings of a foundational belief of Islam. To turn and face Mecca, not Jerusalem. Also, this is when all the raiding takes place, R-A-I-D-I-N-G. The Muslims, him and others, begin raiding caravans that, of course, cross the desert. And that's how they got a lot of their food and supplies and so forth, where they would raid these caravans and steal whatever they needed for their families from them. And at least some of the sources say that they did this because they thought they deserved it for past persecutions. And then the years AD 625, 627, 2 very important battles take place. In this, if you go back and read about these battles, all the details take dozens and dozens of pages, and I'm reducing it to about 2 sentences, so you know I'm leaving a lot out. But these 2 battles take place between the Muslims and different groups. One of them was between Muslims and Jews. In one of the battles, him and his followers had captured 700 Jewish men, and they dug a big grave, kind of reminds us of Hitler and Auschwitz in some of those instances. But these 700 Jewish men were lined up so many a time, and they were beheaded by sword, and then they were pushed into the grave, and then the next group came up. That was one of the 2 battles. I don't remember which of the 2 it was. But a number of battles start taking place that are obviously violent. But there are so many details about that. And then in AD 630, another very significant event occurs. Muhammad takes the city of Mecca back. There were pagans there and so forth, and he basically takes the city back. And hundreds of people pledge allegiance to Islam. He didn't force them to, apparently. but they saw, I guess you might say, the writing on the wall and decided to convert to Islam. And then just 2 years later, in AD 632, he dies at the age of 63. Those are some of the very significant events in his life. Most of them, you'll notice, center around the angel Gabriel. Most of the significant events in some way center around the angel Gabriel. There is one very, very, very big difference between Islam and Christianity. And the rest of the time, that's what I want to talk about very briefly, because the next several Sundays our plan is to look at the differences between the Bible and the Quran. Just kind of like line by line, word by word. The one thing I want to focus on is that unlike Jesus Christ, Muhammad's body still lies in the grave. Muhammad's body still lies in the grave. He wasn't raised from the dead, wasn't resurrected. He's not in heaven reigning over any type of kingdom like Jesus is. In John chapter 20, we have these words. John chapter 20. And all of this chapter is about the empty tomb. And remember that Mary Magdalene was there to see that the tomb was empty. Well, beginning in verse 24, Jesus has risen. People have seen Him. Now, beginning in verse 24, now Thomas, called the twin, one of the 12, was not with them when Jesus came. The other disciples therefore said to him, "We've seen the Lord." So he said to them, "Unless I see in His hands the print of the nails, and put my finger into the print of the nails, and put my hand into His side, I will not believe." And after 8 days His disciples were again inside, and Thomas with them. Jesus came, the doors being shut, and stood in the midst, and said, "Peace to you." Then He said to Thomas, "Reach your finger here, and look at my hands, and reach your hand here, and put it into my side. Do not be unbelieving, but believing." And Thomas answered and said to Him, "My Lord and my God." Jesus said to him, "Thomas, because you've seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen, and yet have believed." That summarizes the difference between Christianity and all other world religions. Because Christianity is based upon the fact that God came to earth in human form, in the form of Jesus. He lived amongst people. He suffered on the cross, shed His blood, was put in a tomb, was buried, and then on the third day, just like He prophesied, He rose from the dead. And this was not done in a secret. I mean, this was not done secretively. Many, many, many people saw Him. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people saw Him after He rose from the dead. His body did not stay in the grave. He walked and talked to numerous people. And then He was seen, Acts chapter 1, leaving this earth, ascending into heaven, where He's been for almost 2,000 years. And that separates Christianity from all other world religions. Our faith is based on an historical, resurrected Savior. And we can know for sure that happened. So when we're baptized for the forgiveness of our sins, that baptism is based on the fact that Jesus not only died on the cross, but rose from the dead. And when we can go to Him and confess our sins, it's based on the fact that He rose from the dead and is reigning in heaven over His kingdom. And that again separates Christianity from every other world religion. Tonight, as David leads us in an invitation song, we need to listen to these words that are inviting us to make decisions. And if you need to make a decision tonight, we encourage you to do that as we stand and sing.